Chairman, before I proceed with my own questions. First, yung pinag-uusapan pong Philippine Grid Code, hindi naman batas to. Sino po nag-issue nito? ERC po, di ba?
Tama po, ERC issuance po.
And the ERC issued Philippine Grid Code applies to both the NGCP and the power producers and the DU.
That's correct. All users of the grid, Your Honor.
Yes, except the consumers.
Not directly kasi po.
Except the consumers. So hindi po dumaan sa Kongreso to at kung babaguhin to, parang rules and regulations lang ito ng ERC.
That's correct, Your Honor.
Next question on ERC, ma'am. How long has the CSP ancillary services that NGCP has tried to contract already or contracted already, how long has it been pending before the ERC's approval?
The DOE issuance was released first in 2019, Your Honor. It took the ERC to issue a show cause order on NGCP to comply with the DOE issuance in 2022.
Kanina po kasi tinanong ni Senator Risa, na-contract nyo na ba? Ang sagot po kanina, oo, nag-CSP na, pero pending pa sa ERC. Ngayon may ibang ancillary service providers daw, mga power plants, na gusto may approval ng ERC bago sila actually mag-supply. So my question is, how long has these been applications for the ancillary services been pending before the ERC and how long before it is finally approved para magamit na ng NGCP?
Sige po. I'll just get from the staff of the period, but we have already approved out of the 37, I think that NGCP contracted, we've already issued provisional authority for 34. Only 3 are pending, Your Honor.
Have you issued even one actual approval?
Yes, Your Honor. 34 approvals.
You said 34 provisional approvals.
Apo.
One actual approval, not provisional. Because my problem is, I roughly know the industry too, ma'am. So, some power generation companies would want approval. So, is this the approval already being awaited for? But
To
provisional
supply.
ang tawag.
It's only called provisional, Your Honor, because there are still, because the law, EPIRA, provides that we need to issue provisional approvals within 75 days. So, we comply with that even if there are hearings still ongoing. So, after the hearings are completed, then we can issue the final approvals
So,
already.
my question is, of their total applied ancillary service that they contracted already, has the ERC issued even one approval? Not provisional, ha?
One final approval, wala pa po akong ma-recall on the 34.
Ang alam ko rin, wala.
Apa.
And how long has it been since you have to issue the provisional approval in 75 days?
Apa.
How long has it been since even one final approval of an ancillary contract, which as mandated by ERC and DOE should go through CSP? Yung proseso na lang na yun, mahirap. I'm familiar with it, ma'am, because Sorsogon was the first province that went through CSP, our cooperative in particular, Surrego 2. So, parang dumaan kami sa butas ng karayan, lalo na kami yung unang-una in the Luzon grid. So, when do you think you can finally issue a final approval of all of these pending contracts, and how long has it been since the first contract was submitted?
I'm just checking, Your Honor, on how long, but the Commission targets within the first quarter will issue the final approvals for the
For all?
for the ASPAS. Opo. Kasi we've grouped them, Your Honor, so that it's easier for us to evaluate them. We've grouped them per technology.
Well, for the information of the committee and the chairman as well, ERC is heavily burdened, Mr. Chairman. One of the things ERC we should look at insofar as ERC is concerned is actually increasing the number of commissioners and the number of staff that they have, because they're understaffed with respect to the function they're supposed to perform, not only under EPIRA, but subsequent legislation and regulations that they themselves issued. Number 2, who is in charge, if any, may I address this to either ERC or DOE, who is in charge of making and ensuring that the power plants that the DOE has approved are being run well, are maintained well, and are still up to the same rated capacity that they were when they were first contracted? And whoever is responsible for that, how often are these plants inspected for that purpose? Yun yung tinatanong kanina ni Chairman Tulfo, na dapat siguraduhin. Now, I am not aware of any law that requires it, but there might be regulation issued already either mandating the ERC, Transco, I don't know, PISAM, I don't know, IMAP, to do it. Is anyone actually looking at these plants to make sure that they are being run well, that all of their protocols for the triggering of the breaker are actually up to specs with the grid code? Who is doing that, ma'am?
Okay. From our end, I will yield later to DOE po. But from ERC's end, we're responsible for making sure that they comply with what we call the reliability indices, that they are on outage only within a certain band that they are on outage. And in fact, Your Honor, if I may mention, we've just issued towards the end of December 65 notices of non-compliance because there were plants that were not in compliance. But on the, Your
Ma'am,
Honor.
but these are based on the reports that they generate themselves and submit to you. My question is, who actually has the technical expertise that actually inspects the plants regularly to make sure that then when they say we're 130 megawatts, that they can actually do 130 megawatts and not simply 80, 60, or 20? And how often is that done? I know that they submit reports, but these reports are again generated by them too.
But we verify them, Your Honor, on the outages because the outages are recorded with NGCP or with the DU if they're connected to the DU. So binabangga po namin yung data. But on the, Your Honor, on the inspections are conducted as a result or as part of the process for applying for what we call certificate of compliance. So ini-inspection po sila at that point in time. But the degradation over time, they declare if their plants are derated or are reduced, but we don't force them to retain a certain level because they're the ones who lose if their plants are actually derated. They cannot supply as much.
They don't want to lose money, but my problem is, if, for example, according to Transco earlier, the simulation conducted in March of 2023 showed that power should be restored within 2 hours and 3 minutes, that is based on the assumption that the plants were functioning at that level too. Hindi ba parang kotse naman, habang nagtatagal, mas matagal i-restart, mas matagal painitin, kailangan muna may procedure na gagawin. It's not as if it's a brand new plant na switch on, switch off, online agad, that synchronized agad. So, I understand that ERC does not have the manpower to do it, but who is actually, remember, these are all privatized plants after we privatized Napocor through PISAM. So, private entities na lahat to. Sino yung nagpupulis sa kanila kung meron man outside of what you're doing based on their reports?
Opo. NGCP po actually sees those data, Your Honor. And in fact, part of the permitting process for us, ERC, before we issue certificate of compliance, to check whether the plants comply with the grid code requirements is to rely on the certification issued by NGCP, the certification to connect. So NGCP does their part also in making sure the plants are performing as required under the code.
So can you submit to us, ma'am, please, a report of, for example, 2022, yung compliance reports na sinasubmit ng lahat ng planta nationwide insofar as the requirements of the ERC is concerned based on the grid code. Now, my next point is, when you say normal as used by NGCP earlier, they're actually referring to a range of values determined by the 6 parameters provided for in the grid code. Would that be a fair statement? It's not a fixed number. It's a range to taking into account the values of the 6 parameters you mentioned under the grid code. Among them, which I mentioned earlier, would be, diniscuss din ni IMAP kanina, frequency, voltage, and unbalance. And there are 3 other more complicated things that I cannot do anymore. But is that a fair statement, ma'am? It's a range.
The range only applies to the voltage and frequency, Your Honor. There are 4 other parameters.
So the 4 others, is it a specific value or percentage?
For single outage contingency criterion, yes, because there is a fixed number. For example, according to the grid code, for the large generator, it's set at 50 for Luzon or 20 for Luzon, 5 megawatts for. So medyo fixed din po yun. For the primary and secondary reserves.
When you say 5 megawatts, it's still a range because it can go down or up
No, anything above po, 5.
Exactly.
Apa.
If it exceeds 5 megawatts, then it's out of the range. If it's below 5 megawatts, then it's within. Again, it's a range. It's not a fixed value. Hindi naman siya isang linya lang, di ba? As you said, like in the Luzon grid, if it exceeds 5 or is below 5,
20.
then, di ba? But what if it's within the 5? So, is it a range or is it a fixed value?
Your Honor, for the large generating unit, it's not a range because for Luzon, for example, the 20 megawatt, anything above 20 is considered already large. So
Ma'am, anything above 20 is considered what? Outside of normal?
no, it's sorry, Your Honor, it's considered a large generating unit. So the outage of which should already raise a flag as a single outage contingency criterion.
Yes, yun yung sinasabi mo kaninang dapat nag-trigger ng notice.
Apa,
Diba?
apa.
I'm talking about the range within which certain things could be done. Notice pa lang naman yun eh, kasi kahit binigyan kayo ng notice, ang tanong pa rin, may dapat bang gawin o wala pa? Now, earlier it was presented by other presenters that when PEDC 1 rated at 83 megawatts, but was providing actually, according to IMAP, 63. I heard another figure earlier of 55. When it had an unscheduled shutdown, the ancillary power kicked in, tinawagan si PCPC na mag-increase, nag-increase din ang supply galing dun sa Negros submarine cable. So, di ba? Again, clearly, nung nawala yung PEDC 1, bumaba. And after a few seconds or minutes, magko-correct dapat yung system, di ba? Now, I agree with you. It should have triggered a significant notice on your part. But at that point, was the grid still stable? Is the definition of a normal grid a value or a range?
No, the definition of a normal state of the grid, Your Honor, is governed by the 6 parameters, some of which cover ranges. The others are whether are existent, whether or determined by a yes or no in terms of whether
Now,
they
based
exist.
on the data submitted to you by NGCP, and I think IMAP also has a copy, from 12:06, after PEDC 1 went offline, had an unscheduled shutdown, up to 2:18. Let's discuss first yung range. Insofar as frequency,
And
voltage, and unbalance, was it still within the range? Tapos tatanungin ko na rin yung remaining 3 na sabi mo, yes or no. Was it still within the range up to 219 before PCPC's breaker kicked in?
So far from the data submitted, Your Honor, the frequency and voltage within range.
Was within range. Now, PCPC earlier showed a chart na tumataas. But of course, this is generated by them based on their own parameters, which, as you said earlier, should comply with the grid code. Right, ma'am?
Apo.
So, my question would be, which is understandable, NGCP will always try to protect their system from being damaged or destroyed. Kaya magkikick in yung breaker at some point in accordance with the grid code. The power plants also would like to protect their plants, which is understandable too. Mahal ng planta eh. So magkikick in din yun pag nag-exceed ng certain levels and thresholds based on their own protocols, which, ma'am, should also comply with the grid code, right?
Tama po.
And the point in time wherein a plant can actually do a manual trip is wider, bigger, than the ranges for frequency, voltage, and imbalance provided for the grid. Would that be correct? Based on your own grid code.
Sorry, Your
Dapat
Honor,
mas
can you
matataas
restate?
yung levels na may exceed bago yung planta mismo makapag-manual trip kesa yung levels ng NGCP. Hindi po ba? Kasi dapat, pag nalumampas na sa NGCP, trip na yun, hindi na siya abot eh. Kaya di ba, yung ginawa niyong range mas malawak. I'm sure you're familiar with the grid code on that, ma'am. There's a distinction between the parameters insofar as FVU is concerned and the power plants.
Sorry. Yes, Your Honor, but I'm not just as confident to say that that the sequence as you had described it is the one that's provided. I need to confirm.
I think what we should determine in order to avoid future occurrences of this would be, ma'am, if those 6 parameters were indeed still met after 206 up to 219 prior to PCPC's breaker being triggered, because after PCPC's breaker was triggered at nawala yung 130 megawatts, assume mo na magdo-domino effect yung ibang planta. Wala ka nang magawa doon. Sasabay na rin yung iba. In fact, tama si Senator Sherwin, walang conspiracy theory because the time involved between the power plants actually shutting down were only a few seconds, some even a few milliseconds. So hindi naman pwedeng pag-usapan to at magtawagan at mag-text sila. Hindi. It was triggered. But when PCPC went off the grid, understandable na ibang planta eh. But my question is, and I think it's what we should crucially determine is, why did yung PCPC plant trip and their breaker was engaged when, based on frequency, voltage, and unbalanced data of the NGCP, within range sila? It should only trip, correct me if I'm wrong, if it is out of range, unless their protocols are more stringent, again, to protect their own plant. Is somebody even looking at those protocols
Yes.
when the
Yes, Your
breaker of the plant will be triggered?
Yes, Your Honor. Part of our investigation is collecting all this data, not just from PCPC, but from all the plants that were affected. And based on their report, to be fair also to all the generators, not just PCPC, in fact, that's in our presentation po. The generators reported within, some of them within minutes, some within 2 hours of the tripping, a voltage imbalance in the grid. That's why they trip, including PCPC. So we're expanding the scope of our investigation, not just to the 216-minute mark, but all the way to the 12, because something must have been happening in the grid to have caused the effect.
To PCPC, sino po yung rep ng PCPC? Yes, sir.
Yes, Senator
Sir,
Escudero.
Go ahead,
you
Mr.
were
Controller.
cut short because you were asked to make a shorter presentation. The assumption is a typical plant, when it trips, can be restarted and can be synchronized in 2 to 4 hours. It took PCPC 3 days. Why, sir?
If I
You
may,
said you had an explanation.
Yeah.
I'm
If I may, I
giving
would
you a
just like to explain why we trip for the
Yes, sir.
understanding. Well, during the outage of Unit 1 of PEDC, there was a drop in voltage in the Panay grid. In fact, my partner here, their voltage at the plant was at 137 and it dropped to 131, which is already a significant drop to the grid. No? Well, of course, NGCP was saying that voltage in our plant was still within parameters. But I think they are correct that we were at 137 kV. But the system voltage is not always the same. It depends on the area, no? Especially in the Iloilo City, because the demand or the large demands are in Iloilo City. Kaya iba po yung voltahe doon. But yun nga, ang sabi ko dito, at 12:20, nag-require po ng increase in excitation ang NGCP, no? So, which we complied, no? At 13:50, nag-require uli siya ng top change. Ibaba ko para tumaas ang voltahe sa system, which we did. But during my presentation, you would notice that from the tripping of PEDC1, our megabar was increasing already because to correct the system voltage, no? In fact, during the tripping at 219, nandun na po sa margin ng instability yung unit ko eh. Kaya po na-trigger yung tripping ng unit.
Wait,
Nag-protect po yung unit ko to protect
Yun nga po
it
yung
siya.
sinasabi ko rin,
Yeah.
di ba?
Opo.
Siyempre, nasa interest nyo, protektahan yung planta. Now, yung factors ba sa pag-trigger ng breaker ninyo, I'm using it very loosely para maintindihan, dahil yung mga bahay may ganun din eh. Pareho ng parameters ng NGCP at ng Philippine Grid Code insofar as the 6 items are concerned, or do you consider other factors that might affect your plant unique to your plant?
Well, that I should say that would be unique to us because that involves the generator capacity. yung generator namin. No? So, what I'm saying here is, yung megabar na ini-induce ko na sa system during that time was already in margins of instability. Yeah.
May I ask the ERC, is the megabar part of the 6 parameters? Or is it another technical term outside of it?
No, Your Honor. It's an additional service that a unit can provide.
So, it's a unique feature of your plant to protect its integrity.
Partly yes, but the inducing of megabar to the grid is a help to the system to normalize the voltage.
Agree, sir.
Yeah.
What I want to understand, sir, and I'm not laying the blame on PCPC. What I want to understand is, in a perfect world, yung trigger ng tripping is one and the same value, range, and parameters. But in the real world, siyempre, magkakaiba yung planta eh.
Yeah.
Yung uri at klase ng planta, coal ba yan, wind ba yan, hydro ba yan, diesel ba yan, so there are certain idiosyncrasies of the plant that need certain levels of protection too.
Yeah. As to the megabar that I was talking about or the stability of the generator, depende po yan sa size ng unit. Gaya ng sinasabi ko, 135 megawatt kami. Yung 150 megawatt, mas malaki yan. Yung 300 megawatt, iba po rin yung stability niyan. So, yung sinasabi ko lang, yung 135 megawatt namin naapektahan ng instability because of yung supply namin ng
Again, sir,
megawatt.
I'm not laying the blame kasi I think it's a gap in the grid code eh. Again, that's why I asked earlier, sino ba nag-i-inspeksyon? Sino ba yung nakakaintinding, nakakaalam para malaman yung rules ba na sinusunod ng DU, ng GENCO, at ng NGCP ay iisa? So that, binabanggit kanina, ba't hindi nyo na-anticipate? Ba't di nyo nakita? Ba't di kayo nakapag-contingency? Eh, iba-iba nga eh. Iba-iba nga eh. Again, according to PCPC, again, I'm not accusing or blaming, but in his own reading of the megabar, which is slightly unique to his plant, it was reaching dangerous levels for the plant already. Would that be a fair statement, sir?
Yes, sir.
Which therefore triggered its breaker. Earlier, you said, ma'am, that they should be following all in the same code. But again, it might not be real on the ground na ganun nga eh. But that part, they should inform not only ERC but NGCP para dun sa simulations, mafa-factory nila yun. Which was not done here clearly because that was apparently a unique feature of their breaker.
But Your Honor, when the April incident happened, among the recommendations that were submitted by the IGMC and also adopted by the ERC are for simulations of all these scenarios. And NGCP reported as of November that they completed all those simulations. So you're correct that these should be seen in simulations. So that's why part of our investigation is, so was this not included among those simulations?
Because the point I'm driving at actually, ma'am, is this. Kumbaga, naghihingalo pa naman yung sistema at grid nung nawala yung PEDC1, hindi pa naman nagpa-flatline. Nung na-trigger yung breaker ng PCPC, masyado nang malaki yung nawawala, nag-flatline na siya. Completely at 3:07 nung nawala na yung Negros submarine. Pero sequentially, in a matter of more than a little over 2 minutes, lahat ng power plant sa Panay subgrid, offline na. Ang power na lang galing sa Negros, di ba? Sa submarine cable. And, of course, dahil hindi kayang higupin na yung kuryente at puro bato na lang, magti-trip na rin yung Negros submarine cable. Di ba? Magti-trigger na rin yung breaker na to protect the system too. Would that be correct? So, the point I'm driving at, ma'am, is that should be predictable. Yung system nila, now may I ask, does NGCP, for example, have the power to actually inspect the plants and not take their word for it insofar as yung mga specs is concerned para magawa nila lahat ng simulation? In their charter, they have that power?
You're absolutely correct, Your Honor. In the grid code allows for it. The connection agreement that they have with the plants allow for it because as I mentioned earlier, we rely on the certifications also of NGCP.
No, but
on
remember,
compliance.
NGCP is not the most popular boy in the block. And I can't say, and you would know this too, that the relation with the power generation companies are, to say the least, good or perfect. So, there are di ba, infighting, squabble, taguan ng feelings, taguan ng papel. Now, is their power to impose and to inspect clear?
Yes, Your Honor, kasi po kahit na if as you put it, kahit na hindi popular, we don't have a choice. The GenCos don't have a choice. There's only one grid that they can connect to.
Agreed.
So whether or not they like that party, they will have to work with that party.
Kaya nga pinopropose ni Senator Risa yung hindi, in divorce law mo. May I ask NGCP, May I ask NGCP, can you confirm that you have the power to actually get all of these details, visit the plants of all the GenCos to make sure that you can do accurate simulations to prevent this from happening again in the future?
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Anyone?
Mr. Santos, thank you for the question, Mr. Santos.
Go ahead.
During the commissioning of a new power plant, when a new power plant applies for a grid connection agreement, that is correct, that we inspect the plant, make sure that its protection settings are consistent with ours. In fact, prior to that, there are already several coordination meetings that should take place, and we follow this to the letter. And then the end of which is for NGCP to issue a certificate of authority to connect. That is commonly called in the industry as a CATC, or a certificate of approval to connect. And after that, then we under the code, we will already rely on what the power plant tells us. In fact, the only time when we can go back to the plant and measure again its performance is if the power plant would apply for a certification to be an ancillary service provider. So these are the only times when we can go to the plant and inspect.
So-
if what they're actually
May I cut you,
saying...
sir? So, the ability of NGCP to inspect is only one time before you issue the certification?
That is correct, Your Honor. And then we can go back to the plant to inspect the plant if their representations are correct when they apply for a certificate to provide ancillary services.
But if they don't,
Then we rely only, if I may say, at face value, Your
ma'am,
Honor.
yun ang significance nung, di ba parang sa LTO, yung mga sasakyan nire-require ng LTO na magpa-inspect na hindi naman sinusunod talaga, pero di ba may MVUC to make sure it's roadworthy. The same is true especially for power plants. Mas marami naman yung kotse kaysa power plant eh. Someone should be checking that knows how to check if indeed the plants are still compliant, if they're rated, and if their warranties when they were initially certified, either by NGCP, DOE, or ERC, are still compliant and valid. Now, you do your checks, but based on their submissions, but di ba, yearly ba yung submission, ma'am? Monthly?
May yearly pong submission, apo. Tapos may periodic po na inspections.
And then, pag may nakita, bibigyan ng